I had lived for 52 years without ever thinking that 4 simple words could destroy the relationship I treasured most in this world. Choose me or her. Those words, spoken with such cold calculation by my son's fiancée on a rainy Thursday evening in my own living room, would shatter everything I believed about family, love, and the lengths a mother would go to protect what matters most. What happened next wasn't just unexpected. It was a complete transformation that no one, especially not Cassandra, could have seen coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But let me start from the beginning, because understanding how deeply I loved my son Daniel will help you understand why what came next was so devastating and ultimately so necessary. Daniel had always been my miracle child. After 3 miscarriages and years of fertility treatments, he came into this world on a snowy December morning in Portland, Oregon, weighing barely 5 pounds but fighting with the determination that would define his entire life. His father, my ex-husband Robert, had walked out when Daniel was only 7, claiming he, quote, never wanted the responsibility of a family anyway. From that moment on, it was just Daniel and me against the world. I worked 2 jobs to put him through school, cleaning offices at night and working as a receptionist during the day at a small law firm downtown. Every penny I earned went toward giving Daniel the life I never had. Piano lessons when he showed an interest in music, soccer cleats when he made the team, SAT prep courses when college applications rolled around. I drove a 15-year-old Honda with a rattling engine and wore the same 3 work outfits on rotation, but Daniel never went without. When he graduated valedictorian from Lincoln High School, I cried harder than I had since the day he was born. When he got a full scholarship to Oregon State University for engineering, I felt like all those sleepless nights had finally paid off. When he landed his dream job at a tech company in Seattle after graduation, I was so proud I could barely contain myself. Daniel and I had always been incredibly close. He called me every Sunday without fail, visited every holiday, and never made a major decision without asking for my advice first. When he was struggling with his first job, I was the one he turned to. When he bought his first house, a small but charming craftsman bungalow in the Wallingford neighborhood of Seattle, I was the first person he showed around. When he got promoted to senior software engineer, I was the first person he called. Mom, he'd say, I couldn't have done any of this without you. You're my hero. Those words meant everything to me. They validated every sacrifice, every missed meal, every time I chose to pay for his needs instead of my own. I had built my entire identity around being Daniel's mother, his supporter, his biggest fan. It was the role that gave my life meaning and purpose. Our relationship was built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared memories of overcoming hardship together. We had inside jokes that dated back to his childhood. We could talk for hours about everything and nothing. When he moved to Seattle for work, the distance was hard, but our bond remained unshakable, or so I thought. I lived in a cozy 2-bedroom apartment in the Hawthorne district of Portland, filled with photos of Daniel from every stage of his life. His elementary school artwork still hung on my refrigerator. His high school football jersey was framed in my hallway. His college graduation photo sat prominently on my mantle. My friends used to tease me about being too attached to my son, but I didn't care. Daniel was my greatest accomplishment, my pride and joy, my reason for getting up every morning. My daily routine revolved around our connection. I'd wake up thinking about what Daniel might be doing that day. I'd send him encouraging texts before important meetings. I'd research articles about his industry to share with him. On weekends, I'd meal prep extra portions and drive the 3 hours to Seattle to stock his freezer with homemade lasagna and his favorite chocolate chip cookies, the same recipe I'd been making since he was 8 years old. My social life was modest but fulfilling. I had coffee every Tuesday with my neighbor Ruth, who had become like a sister to me over the years. I volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends when I wasn't visiting Daniel. I took evening art classes at the community center, finally pursuing the painting hobby I'd put on hold for 25 years while raising my son. It was a quiet, simple life, but it was mine, and I was content. The center of my universe, though, was always Daniel. His happiness was my happiness. His success was my success. His problems became my problems to solve. This wasn't unhealthy attachment. It was the natural result of being a single mother who had poured her entire heart into raising an extraordinary young man. At least, that's what I told myself. I had dreams for our future together, too. I imagined Sunday dinners when he got married, where I'd teach his wife my secret recipes. I pictured myself as a grandmother someday, spoiling Daniel's children the way I'd always spoiled him. I envisioned holiday traditions continuing, family vacations, where 3 generations would create new memories together. I saw myself growing old with the comfort of knowing that Daniel would always be part of my life, that the bond we'd forged through years of struggle and love would never be broken. In my mind, any woman who was lucky enough to marry Daniel would understand what a special relationship we had. She'd appreciate the sacrifices I'd made and the role I'd played in shaping the incredible man she was getting. She'd welcome me into their family with open arms, grateful for the foundation I'd provided. She'd see me as an ally, not a threat. I was about to learn just how naive that assumption was. But on this particular rainy Thursday evening, as I puttered around my kitchen making Daniel's favorite beef stew for his weekend visit, I was still living in that innocent world where I believed love was always enough, where family bonds were unbreakable, and where the woman my son chose to marry would naturally become like a daughter to me. I had no idea that in less than 2 hours, everything I believed about my life, my son, and my place in his future would come crashing down around me. I had no idea that the young woman I'd been trying so hard to welcome into our family had been plotting to remove me from it entirely. I had no idea that I was about to face the fight of my life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was watering my geraniums on the apartment balcony. Daniel's name lit up my phone screen, and I answered with my usual cheerful greeting. "Good morning, sweetheart. How's my favorite son doing today?" "Hey, Mom." Daniel's voice carried an unusual excitement that immediately caught my attention. "I have some incredible news. Are you sitting down?" I laughed, settling into my wicker chair overlooking the Hawthorne district. "Now you're making me nervous. What's going on?" "Mom, I proposed to Cassandra last night. She said yes. We're engaged." The words hit me like a warm wave of joy mixed with something I couldn't quite identify, maybe surprise, maybe a tiny flutter of uncertainty. I'd been expecting this moment for months, ever since Daniel had started dropping hints about ring shopping, but hearing it made real felt both thrilling and overwhelming. "Oh my goodness, Daniel, congratulations, honey. I'm so happy for you both." I genuinely meant it, though part of me wondered why the news felt slightly bittersweet. "Tell me everything. How did you propose?" Daniel's voice bubbled with enthusiasm as he described the elaborate proposal he'd planned at Cary Park in Seattle, complete with fairy lights, Cassandra's favorite flowers, and a photographer hidden in the bushes to capture the moment. As he spoke, I found myself smiling despite the odd knot in my stomach. She was completely surprised, Mom. She started crying. Happy tears, of course. And the ring. God, I hope I picked the right one. It's this vintage Art Deco style with a princess-cut diamond. Cost me 3 months' salary, but she's worth every penny. I'm sure it's perfect, sweetheart. She's lucky to have someone who puts so much thought into making her happy. I paused, then added, "So when do I get to congratulate the bride-to-be in person?" There was a brief silence on the other end. "Actually, Mom, that's part of why I'm calling. Cassandra and I want to drive down to Portland this weekend to celebrate with you." She's really excited to start planning the wedding, and she specifically asked if we could include you in some of the early discussions. My heart swelled with warmth. Despite my occasional reservations about Cassandra, nothing major, just small moments where she seemed a bit cool toward me, it sounded like she genuinely wanted me to be part of their journey. Maybe I'd been overthinking things. That sounds wonderful, Daniel. I'll make your favorite beef stew, and we can open that bottle of champagne I've been saving for a special occasion. Perfect. Oh, and Mom? Cassandra mentioned she'd love to hear stories about my childhood. She says she wants to understand what shaped me into the man I am today. Something about the way he said it struck me as odd, formal, almost rehearsed, but I brushed the feeling aside. Of course, I have so many stories to share. And photo albums. Oh, she'll love seeing your baby pictures. Great. We'll drive down Saturday morning and spend the whole weekend. I can't wait for you two to really bond. Cassandra keeps saying how important it is to her that my family loves her. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony for a long time, watching the morning joggers pass by on the street below. The engagement should have filled me with pure joy, but there was something nagging at me that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was just natural mother's anxiety about sharing my son with another woman. Maybe it was the fact that in the 8 months Daniel had been dating Cassandra, our interactions had been pleasant but somehow surface level. I thought back to the few times I'd spent with Cassandra during my visits to Seattle. She was undeniably beautiful, tall and elegant, with glossy auburn hair and striking green eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She worked as a marketing executive at a luxury skincare company, drove a pristine white BMW, and always looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Her apartment was immaculate, decorated in whites and grays that looked expensive but felt cold to me. During our conversations, Cassandra was always polite, always said the right things, but I never felt like I was seeing the real her. She'd ask about my life in Portland, but her eyes would glaze over slightly when I talked about my volunteer work or my art classes. She'd compliment my homemade cookies but never actually finish eating one. She'd smile when Daniel told stories about our family traditions, but the smile never quite reached her eyes. I'd mentioned my concerns to Daniel once, very gently, asking if Cassandra was naturally reserved, or if maybe she felt nervous around me. He'd laughed it off, saying she was just sophisticated and that some people took time to warm up. "She's not like us, Mom," he'd said. "She didn't grow up with a lot of family traditions and cozy Sunday dinners. Her parents were more formal. But she loves me, and she's trying to understand our way of doing things." Now, as I prepared for their weekend visit, I decided to give Cassandra the benefit of the doubt. This was her engagement weekend, after all. Maybe this would be the breakthrough moment where we finally connected as future family members. Maybe she'd been holding back because she wasn't sure of her place in Daniel's life yet, and now that they were engaged, she'd feel secure enough to let her guard down. I spent the rest of the week planning the perfect weekend. I bought ingredients for all of Daniel's favorite meals, picked up a beautiful bouquet of white roses for Cassandra, and even purchased a bottle of expensive wine I'd seen her admire during one of her visits. I cleaned my apartment until it sparkled, arranged fresh flowers in every room, and dug out photo albums spanning Daniel's entire life. On Friday evening, I called my friend Ruth to share the news. "Daniel's engaged," I announced as soon as she picked up. "Oh, how wonderful! To the marketing girl, Catherine?" "Cassandra," I corrected, "and yes, they're driving down tomorrow to celebrate." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You sound happy, but is everything okay? Your voice seems a little strained." I sighed. Ruth knew me too well. "I am happy. I really am. It's just, I don't know. Something feels different about Daniel lately. He's been more distant, and when we talk, it's like he's choosing his words carefully. And Cassandra, I've been trying so hard to connect with her, but she always seems like she's holding something back. Honey, you know how it is when people first fall in love. They get wrapped up in each other, and maybe she's just nervous about getting your approval. You're pretty important to Daniel." Maybe you're right. I wanted to believe it. I'm probably just being an overprotective mother. "Give her a chance. Ruth advised. And remember, if Daniel loves her, there must be something wonderful about her that maybe you just haven't seen yet. Saturday morning arrived with that peculiar mix of excitement and anxiety I'd been carrying all week. I set the dining room table with my good china, arranged the white roses in a crystal vase, and put the champagne on ice. The beef stew was simmering perfectly, filling the apartment with rich, comforting aromas. When I heard Daniel's key in the front door, followed by his familiar, "Mom, we're here," I felt a surge of pure happiness. Whatever my reservations about Cassandra, Daniel was home, and he was happy. That's all that really mattered. I had no idea that this weekend, which I'd planned as a celebration, was actually going to be an ambush. I had no idea that Cassandra hadn't come to Portland to bond with me or plan a wedding. She'd come to deliver an ultimatum that would change everything. But in that moment, as I walked toward the front door with a genuine smile on my face and love in my heart, I still believed that family could overcome anything, that love was always enough, and that the three of us were about to become a team. I was about to learn just how wrong I could be. Daniel walked through my front door with his usual broad smile, pulling me into one of his signature bear hugs that always made me feel like the most important person in the world. Behind him, Cassandra stepped into my living room wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and dark jeans that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her engagement ring caught the afternoon light streaming through my windows, a stunning princess-cut diamond that was even more beautiful than Daniel had described. "Congratulations, sweetheart," I said, embracing her warmly and pressing the bouquet of white roses into her hands. "Welcome to the family." Cassandra's smile was picture-perfect, but something in her green eyes seemed to flicker, just for a moment, before she composed herself. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. The flowers are lovely." Mrs. Thompson. After 8 months of dating my son, she still couldn't bring herself to call me by my first name, despite my repeated invitations to do so. But I pushed the thought aside. Today was about celebration. The first few hours went smoothly enough. We opened the champagne, toasted their engagement, and I served lunch on my good china. Daniel regaled us with more details about the proposal, while Cassandra showed appropriate enthusiasm, though I noticed she kept checking her phone every few minutes. When I brought out the photo albums, Daniel's face lit up with the same boyish excitement he'd had as a child. "Oh God, Mom, not the baby pictures," he groaned, but he was laughing as he pulled Cassandra closer on the couch. "Prepare yourself. She has documentation of every embarrassing moment of my childhood." I settled into my favorite armchair, opening the first album to a picture of Daniel at age 3, covered head to toe in chocolate cake from his birthday party. "This was right after he decided the cake looked better on him than on the plate," I said, launching into the story. For the next hour, I shared memory after memory. Daniel's first day of school, when he cried and clung to my leg until his teacher distracted him with finger paints. His Little League games, where I cheered so loudly from the bleachers that other parents would stare. The Halloween when he insisted on being a dinosaur 3 years in a row. His high school graduation speech, where he thanked me in front of the entire auditorium for being the best mom a kid could ask for. Daniel laughed at all the right moments, adding his own commentary and corrections to my stories. But as I glanced at Cassandra, I noticed her smile becoming increasingly strained. She nodded politely at each anecdote, made appropriate sounds of interest, but her body language was growing more rigid by the minute. "You two certainly have a very close relationship," she said finally, her tone carefully neutral. "We do," I replied, not catching the subtle edge in her voice. "When it's just been the two of you against the world for so many years, you develop a special bond. Daniel's always been my best friend." Something shifted in Cassandra's expression. So quickly I almost missed it. But Daniel, absorbed in a photo of his senior prom, didn't seem to notice anything amiss. As the afternoon progressed, I began picking up on small tensions I hadn't noticed before. When I mentioned our Sunday phone call tradition, Cassandra's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When Daniel laughed about how I still packed his freezer with homemade meals during my visits, she examined her manicure with sudden intensity. When I showed her the guest room I'd prepared for their weekend stay, Daniel's childhood room, which I'd kept exactly as he'd left it for college, she made a comment about it being very preserved. But the real shift came during dinner preparation. I was in the kitchen putting finishing touches on the beef stew when I overheard Cassandra and Daniel talking in low voices in the living room. "Think this weekend would be a good time to set some boundaries," she was saying. "Boundaries?" Daniel's voice sounded confused. "About expectations going forward, about what our marriage is going to look like." I froze, straining to hear more, but their voices dropped even lower. When I called them for dinner a few minutes later, both wore expressions that seemed forced. Daniel looked uncomfortable, while Cassandra appeared to have made some kind of decision. Dinner conversation was stilted compared to the easy flow of the afternoon. Cassandra complimented the stew but barely touched it. Daniel seemed distracted, answering my questions about work and wedding plans with uncharacteristic brevity. I found myself working harder and harder to keep the conversation going, filling silences that had never existed between Daniel and me before. After we finished eating, I suggested we move to the living room for coffee and the chocolate cake I'd made from scratch, Daniel's favorite recipe that I'd been perfecting for 25 years. But as I was clearing the dishes, Cassandra stood up abruptly. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, before we have dessert, there's something Daniel and I need to discuss with you." The formal tone of her voice made my stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "Of course, dear. Let me just put these in the dishwasher." "No." Her voice was sharp enough to make both Daniel and me turn to stare at her. "This can't wait." Daniel looked as surprised as I felt. "Cassandra, maybe we should." "Sit down, both of you." There was no warmth in her voice now, no pretense of politeness. This was a different woman entirely from the one who'd smiled graciously over lunch just hours earlier. I sat back down at my dining room table, my hands suddenly trembling. Daniel remained standing, looking back and forth between Cassandra and me with growing alarm. "Cassandra, what's going on?" he asked. She ignored him, fixing her cold green eyes directly on me. "Mrs. Thompson, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what's going to change now that Daniel and I are engaged." The word change hung in the air like a threat. "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully. "I think you understand perfectly." Cassandra's voice was ice cold now, all pretense of politeness completely abandoned. This little charade of family closeness, the constant phone calls, the surprise visits, the way you've inserted yourself into every aspect of Daniel's life, that ends now. I felt like I'd been slapped. "Excuse me? Mom, what is she talking about?" Daniel's voice cracked with confusion. Cassandra turned to him with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Your mother has an unhealthy attachment to you, Daniel. She's never learned to let go, never learned to respect boundaries. Look around this room. It's like a shrine to you. This isn't normal mother-son relationship. This is emotional dependency." The words hit me like physical blows. "How dare you?" "How dare I what? Tell the truth?" Cassandra's voice rose slightly. "You call him every Sunday without fail, whether he's busy or not. You drive 3 hours every few weeks to stock his freezer like he's incapable of feeding himself. You've kept his childhood bedroom like a museum. You insert yourself into conversations about our relationship, our future, our wedding plans." I was trying to be supportive. "You were trying to maintain control." Cassandra's eyes were blazing now. "And it stops today. Because Daniel has to choose between having a healthy marriage with me or continuing this codependent relationship with you." The room fell into absolute silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could feel the blood draining from my face. Daniel stood frozen between us, his mouth slightly open in shock. "Choose?" I whispered. Cassandra turned back to Daniel, her voice taking on a softer, more manipulative tone. Sweetheart, you know I'm right. A man can't have two women as the center of his universe. You're about to be my husband. That means I come first. Not your mother. Cassandra, this is insane, Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? She walked over to him, placing her hand on his chest. When was the last time you made a major decision without calling your mother first? When was the last time we had a weekend together without her calling or texting multiple times? When was the last time you told me something important before you told her? I watched in horror as uncertainty flickered across my son's face. She was getting to him. Daniel, I said, my voice barely audible, she can't be serious. Cassandra whirled back to face me, and in that moment I saw her true nature for the first time. There was no warmth, no love, no family feeling. There was only cold calculation and ruthless determination. I am completely serious, Mrs. Thompson. Here's what's going to happen. The weekly phone calls stop. The surprise visits stop. The constant involvement in our lives stops. Daniel and I will see you on major holidays. Christmas, maybe Thanksgiving. And that's it. You can't, I started to protest. I'm not finished. Her voice cut through my words like a blade. And if you can't accept these new boundaries, if you try to manipulate Daniel or guilt him into maintaining this unhealthy relationship, then you won't see him at all. The room was spinning. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Daniel, tell her she's wrong. Tell her that's not how our family works. For a long, terrible moment, my son said nothing. He stood there, looking back and forth between the woman he wanted to marry and the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, and I could see the war playing out on his face. Finally he spoke, and his words shattered what was left of my world. Mom, he said quietly, maybe Cassandra has a point. Maybe we have been a little too close. In that moment, everything I had believed about my relationship with my son, everything I had built my life around, crumbled to dust. The woman I had tried so hard to welcome into our family had just declared war on me, and my own son, the child I had given everything for, was choosing her side. Cassandra smiled triumphantly, sensing victory. So, Mrs. Thompson, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, what's it going to be? Can you respect our boundaries and have a limited relationship with your son? Or are you going to force him to choose between his future wife and his overly attached mother? The ultimatum hung in the air between us like a loaded gun, and for the first time in my life I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. I stared at Daniel, waiting for him to take back those words, waiting for him to laugh and tell Cassandra she was being ridiculous, waiting for my son, the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who called me his hero just 6 months ago, to defend the relationship that had been the foundation of both our lives. But the laughter never came, the defense never came. Instead, Daniel stood there avoiding my eyes, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking like a stranger wearing my son's face. Daniel? My voice came out as barely a whisper. You can't possibly agree with this. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his expression made my chest tighten with panic. Guilt, yes, but also something that looked disturbingly like relief. As if Cassandra had given him permission to voice doubts he'd been harboring, but never dared speak aloud. Mom, He ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd seen him make since childhood. I love you. You know I love you. But maybe it would be healthy for both of us to have some space, to let me really grow up and be independent. The words felt like ice water flooding my veins. Independent? Daniel, you are independent. You have your own house, your own career, your own life. How is calling your mother once a week preventing your independence? See? Cassandra interjected smoothly, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this response. This is what I'm talking about. She can't even accept the suggestion of boundaries without getting defensive and emotional. I'm not getting defensive, I snapped, then immediately heard how defensive I sounded. I'm trying to understand how wanting to maintain a relationship with my son suddenly makes me the problem here. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Mom, it's not that simple. Yes, it is that simple. The words burst out of me with more force than I'd intended. Daniel, this woman just told you that loving your mother is unhealthy. She just demanded that you choose between your future wife and the woman who raised you single-handedly for 25 years. How is any of that reasonable? Because healthy adults don't need to talk to their mothers every single week, Cassandra said, her voice taking on that patient, condescending tone again. Healthy adults don't need their mothers driving hours to stock their freezers. Healthy adults make decisions without consulting mommy first. Each word was like a slap, but what hurt more was watching Daniel nod slightly at some of them. But that's what families do, I said desperately, looking between them. That's what people who love each other do. They stay in touch. They help each other. They share their lives. Daniel, when your father left, you and I promised we'd always be there for each other. Always. I was 7 years old, Mom. Daniel's voice was quiet, but the words cut deep. Maybe it's time to reevaluate promises made by a scared little boy. I felt like the floor was dissolving beneath my feet. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be my son speaking these words. A scared little boy? Daniel, you called me 2 weeks ago asking for advice about whether to propose. You called me last month when you got that promotion, excited to share the news. This is who we are. This is who we've always been. And maybe that's the problem, Cassandra said coldly. Maybe it's time Daniel started sharing important news with his fiancée first, instead of his mother. I turned to stare at her, seeing her clearly for the first time since she'd walked into my home. The perfectly arranged auburn hair, the expensive clothes, the way she held herself like she owned every room she entered. But most chilling of all was the complete absence of any warmth or empathy in her eyes as she watched me fall apart. You planned this, I said suddenly, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. This whole weekend. The engagement celebration. Asking to hear stories about Daniel's childhood. Wanting to include me in wedding planning. It was all a lie. You came here to ambush me. Cassandra's smile was razor sharp. I came here to set appropriate boundaries for our future relationship. The fact that you're taking it as an attack says everything about your mindset. My mindset? I was struggling to keep my voice steady. My mindset is that I love my son and want to be part of his life. My mindset is that families support each other through good times and bad. What exactly is wrong with that mindset? What's wrong, Daniel said quietly, is that sometimes it feels like I can't breathe. The room went dead silent. Those 7 words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I felt something inside my chest crack open. What did you just say? I whispered. Daniel's face crumpled with guilt, but he pressed on. Mom, I love you. I love you so much. But sometimes it feels like I'm still that 7-year-old boy you're trying to protect. Like you can't see that I'm a grown man who needs to make his own decisions, his own mistakes. But I do see that, I protested, even as doubt began creeping into my voice. I've always encouraged your independence. I was proud when you moved to Seattle, proud when you bought your house. Were you? Daniel's voice was growing stronger, as if Cassandra's presence was giving him courage to voice thoughts he'd been suppressing. Or were you proud that I still needed you enough to call every week and ask for your approval on everything? The question hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came. Because somewhere, in a part of my heart I didn't want to examine, I wondered if there might be a grain of truth in what he was saying. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Cassandra said, her voice filled with fake sympathy. Look at her face, Daniel. She can't even conceive of a world where you don't need her constant involvement in your life. That's not healthy love. That's control. It's not control. I found my voice again, but it came out shrill and desperate. It's love. It's caring. Daniel, when you were sick with pneumonia in college, Who drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to take care of you? When you were struggling with your first job and calling me crying every night, who talked you through it? When you bought your house and needed help with the down payment, you always bring up the money, Cassandra interrupted smoothly. Always. Every conversation comes back to what you've sacrificed, what you've given up, what you've paid for. That's not love, Mrs. Thompson. That's emotional manipulation. That's not. I was sputtering now, my thoughts scattered by the speed and cruelty of her attacks. Daniel, you know that's not what I meant. You know I've never thrown those things in your face. But even as I said it, I could see in Daniel's expression that maybe I had. Maybe without realizing it, I had used my sacrifices as a way to maintain my importance in his life. Maybe every time I reminded him of what I'd given up for him, I was also reminding him of what he owed me. I need some air, Daniel said suddenly, heading toward the balcony. I need to think. Daniel, don't walk away from this conversation, Cassandra called after him, but he was already sliding the glass door open and stepping outside. That left Cassandra and me alone in my living room, facing each other across the dining table that still held the remnants of what was supposed to be a celebration dinner. The silence stretched between us, heavy with hostility and unspoken threats. You're enjoying this, I said finally. Cassandra tilted her head, studying me like I was an interesting specimen under a microscope. I'm not enjoying it, Mrs. Thompson, but I'm not going to apologize for protecting my relationship either. Protecting your relationship? By destroying mine? By setting healthy boundaries that should have been established years ago. She leaned back in her chair, completely at ease now that Daniel wasn't in the room. You want to know the truth? Daniel has been talking about feeling suffocated for months. He just didn't know how to bring it up without hurting your feelings. The words felt like acid in my ears. That's not true. Isn't it? When was the last time Daniel made a major decision without running it by you first? When was the last time he went a week without calling? When was the last time he brought a girlfriend home who didn't feel like she was competing with his mother for his attention? Each question was another dagger, perfectly aimed at my deepest insecurities. Because the truth was, I couldn't remember the last time Daniel had done any of those things. And I had always thought that meant we had a close, healthy relationship. But sitting here, looking at the cold calculation in Cassandra's eyes, I was beginning to wonder if I had been lying to myself for years. Through the glass balcony door, I could see Daniel pacing back and forth in the evening air, his phone pressed to his ear. Even from inside, his body language screamed stress and confusion. I wondered who he was calling. His best friend Marcus, maybe, or his colleague Jennifer, who had become something of a confidant. Anyone but me. Cassandra followed my gaze and smiled that cold, satisfied smile. He's probably calling his therapist. His what? The word came out strangled. Dr. Harrison. Daniel's been seeing him for about 3 months now. She examined her perfectly manicured nails with casual indifference. Funny how he never mentioned that to you, isn't it? The revelation hit me like a freight train. Daniel had been in therapy for 3 months. 3 months. And hadn't said a word to me. Daniel, who used to tell me about every doctor's appointment, every work meeting, every minor inconvenience in his day. Why? I managed to whisper. Because he was struggling with guilt about wanting distance from you, but feeling like he couldn't have it without destroying you. Cassandra's voice carried that clinical detachment again, as if she were discussing the weather. Dr. Harrison helped him understand that healthy adult relationships require boundaries, even with parents, especially with parents who never learn to let go. I sank deeper into my chair, feeling like the walls of my carefully constructed world were closing in around me. You're lying. Am I? Cassandra pulled out her phone and scrolled through something, then turned the screen toward me. It was a text conversation between her and Daniel, dated just 2 weeks ago. Daniel, had another session with Dr. H today. We talked about the wedding and how to handle my mom's expectations. Cassandra, what did he say? Daniel, that it's normal for mothers to struggle with their sons getting married, but I need to be clear about priorities. You come first now. Cassandra, and how do you feel about that? Daniel, relieved honestly, guilty but relieved. The phone screen blurred as tears filled my eyes. I blinked them back, refusing to give Cassandra the satisfaction of seeing me cry. But the damage was done. Those words, relieved honestly, kept echoing in my mind like a death knell. He's been planning this conversation for weeks, Cassandra continued, sliding her phone back into her purse. The engagement was just the perfect opportunity to finally have it. A new chapter, clean slate, all that. But he loves me, I said weakly, hating how pathetic I sounded. Of course he loves you. That was never the question. Cassandra leaned forward, her green eyes boring into mine. The question is whether that love is healthy or toxic. And after months of therapy, Daniel is finally beginning to understand the difference. Daniel's voice drifted in from the balcony, muffled but audible. I know. It's just harder than I thought it would be. She looks so hurt. Cassandra tilted her head toward the sound. He's probably telling Dr. Harrison about tonight, about how you reacted exactly the way they predicted you would, with guilt, manipulation, and emotional blackmail. I didn't. When you were sick with pneumonia, who drove 4 hours? When you needed help with the down payment? After everything I've sacrificed for you? Cassandra's voice took on a mocking tone as she repeated my earlier words. That's textbook emotional manipulation, Mrs. Thompson. Using past sacrifices to control present behavior. Each word felt like a scalpel, cutting away at the foundation of everything I believed about myself as a mother. Those weren't manipulations. Those were expressions of love. Were they? Or were they investments you expected to pay dividends forever? Cassandra's smile was razor-sharp now. Let me ask you something. When Daniel bought his house, did you offer to help with the down payment because you wanted to ease his burden? Or because you wanted to make sure he'd always owe you something? The question hung in the air like poison gas. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died in my throat. Because if I was being completely honest with myself, and Cassandra's relentless psychological dissection was forcing that honesty, there had been a small part of me that felt satisfied knowing Daniel needed me for such a major milestone. When you drive 3 hours to stock his freezer, Cassandra pressed on, is it because he can't feed himself? Or because it gives you a reason to be indispensable? When you call every Sunday without fail, is it because you miss him? Or because you're afraid that if you don't maintain that routine, he might realize he doesn't actually need to talk to you that often? Each question was like a mirror being held up to my soul, reflecting back distorted images of motivations I'd never wanted to examine too closely. The worst part was that Cassandra wasn't entirely wrong. Mixed in with all my genuine love and concern for Daniel, there had always been an undercurrent of need. My need to be needed, my need to remain the most important woman in his life. You don't understand, I said desperately. When his father left. Ah, yes, the abandonment card. Cassandra's voice dripped with disdain. Daniel told me all about how you've used his father's abandonment to justify your overbearing behavior for the past 25 years. It's just been us against the world. We promised we'd always be there for each other, classic trauma bonding. The clinical terms she was throwing around made my head spin. Trauma bonding? That wasn't trauma bonding. That was survival. That was two people who loved each other getting through a difficult time together. Was it? Or was it a grown woman placing the emotional burden of her adult relationships on a 7-year-old child? Cassandra leaned back, watching my face carefully. Think about it, Mrs. Thompson. When Robert left, you didn't seek adult support. You didn't go to therapy or join a support group or lean on friends. You turned to Daniel, a child, and made him your emotional partner. You made him responsible for your happiness. The room felt like it was spinning. Everything Cassandra was saying sounded so clinical, so professional, like she'd been coached by the same therapist who'd been filling my son's head with these ideas. "That's not what happened," I whispered, but even I could hear the doubt creeping into my voice. "Isn't it?" "When Daniel was 8 and you were crying about not being able to pay the bills, who comforted you? When he was 12 and you were lonely on Saturday nights, who stayed home with you instead of going to sleepovers? When he was 16 and got accepted to colleges across the country, who convinced him that Oregon State was the better choice because it was closer to home?" Each memory she dredged up felt like a physical blow, because they were all true. Every single one of them was true, and I'd never seen them the way she was presenting them now. "He wanted to stay close to home," I protested weakly. "Did he? Or did you make him feel guilty about the idea of leaving you alone?" Cassandra's voice was relentless now. "Daniel told me about the conversation you had when he was considering Stanford. How you cried and said you didn't know what you'd do without him. How you asked him how he could abandon you after everything you'd been through together." The memory came flooding back with crystalline clarity. Daniel, 17 years old, sitting at this very dining room table with acceptance letters spread in front of him. Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, all offering him opportunities I could never have dreamed of. And me, panicking at the thought of him being so far away, saying things I'd convinced myself were honest expressions of my feelings, but which I was now seeing through a very different lens. "He was just a boy," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. "Exactly, he was just a boy, and you made your emotional needs his responsibility." Cassandra's voice was cold and factual, like she was reading from a psychology textbook. "Do you have any idea how much pressure that put on him? How much guilt he's carried his entire adult life about wanting normal independence?" Through the glass door, I could see Daniel finishing his phone call. He stood at the balcony railing for a long moment, staring out at the Portland skyline, before slowly turning back toward the apartment. "Here's what's going to happen," Cassandra said quietly, her voice taking on a different quality, harder, more businesslike. "Daniel is going to come back in here, and he's going to try to find some middle ground, because that's who he is. He's going to suggest maybe calling every other week instead of every week, or maybe visiting once a month instead of twice, and you're going to think that's reasonable and fair." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But it's not going to be enough for me, because I'm not interested in managing your dependency. I'm interested in ending it. So you can agree to my original terms, holidays only, minimal contact, no more involvement in our day-to-day lives, or you can lose him completely." The sliding door opened, and Daniel stepped back inside, his face pale and drawn. He looked older somehow, aged by the conversation he'd just had and the one he was about to have. "Mom," he said softly, "we need to talk." But as I looked at my son, really looked at him, I realized I wasn't seeing the Daniel I thought I knew. I was seeing a stranger who'd been hiding his true feelings from me for months, maybe years. A stranger who'd been discussing our relationship with therapists and fiancés, but never with me. And the most terrifying part was that I was beginning to understand why. Daniel sat down heavily at the dining room table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. The confident, successful man who had walked through my door just hours earlier now looked like that uncertain 7-year-old boy again, caught between conflicting loyalties and drowning in guilt. "Dr. Harrison thinks this conversation was necessary," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "He says these kinds of family dynamics don't resolve themselves. They have to be addressed directly." The mention of this mysterious therapist, this stranger who apparently knew more about my son's inner life than I did, sent a fresh wave of betrayal through my chest. But as I sat there, looking at Daniel's tortured expression and listening to Cassandra's breathing beside me like a predator waiting to pounce, something else began to happen. Memories started flooding back. Not the warm, golden memories I usually treasured, but different ones. Memories I'd buried or reframed over the years because they didn't fit the narrative I'd built about our perfect mother-son relationship. Daniel at age 10 crying because he wanted to go to summer camp like his friend Tyler, but I'd convinced him we couldn't afford it. The truth was, We probably could have managed it, but the thought of him being away for 2 whole weeks had terrified me. So instead, I'd planned elaborate day trips and activities, telling him we were having our own special summer that was better than any camp. I remembered how his face had lit up when I said that, how he'd hugged me and agreed that our adventures were more fun than camp could ever be. At the time, I'd been so proud of how I'd turned his disappointment into excitement. Now I wondered if I'd simply taught him that his desires mattered less than my comfort. Daniel, at 13, invited to his first boy-girl party. I'd interrogated him for an hour about who would be there, what they'd be doing, whether there would be adequate supervision. By the time I was done, he looked so overwhelmed that he'd asked if he could just stay home and watch movies with me instead. I'd been delighted, telling myself it showed how much he valued our relationship over peer pressure. But had it? Or had I made the social navigation of early adolescence feel so fraught and complicated that staying home seemed easier? Daniel, at 16, getting his driver's license. Most parents were eager for their teenagers to gain independence, to stop being chauffeurs, but I'd found excuse after excuse for why Daniel still needed me to drive him places. The car wasn't reliable enough for long trips. Gas was expensive. I was going that direction anyway, so why waste money? I'd told myself I was being practical, responsible. But sitting here now, I could see the pattern Cassandra was talking about. Every milestone that should have increased Daniel's independence, I'd found ways to maintain my necessity in his life. Mom? Daniel's voice broke through my spiraling thoughts. Are you okay? You look pale. Even now, even in the middle of this devastating conversation, his first instinct was to worry about me, to take care of my emotional state instead of processing his own feelings. How had I never seen that before? I was just remembering things, I said slowly. Cassandra leaned forward with interest. What kinds of things? I wanted to lie, to deflect, to protect the carefully constructed story I'd been telling myself for 25 years. But the weight of recognition was crushing down on me, making denial impossible. The summer camp, I whispered, when Daniel was 10. He wanted to go so badly, But you what? Cassandra's voice was gentle now, which somehow made it more terrifying than her earlier coldness. I convinced him he didn't really want to go. I made him think staying home with me was better. The admission felt like swallowing broken glass. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. You remember that? I remember a lot of things differently now. I couldn't look at him as I spoke. The driving lessons I kept postponing because I said you weren't ready. The college applications I helped you narrow down by pointing out all the problems with the faraway schools. The job offer in Denver you turned down because I said I'd be so lonely without you nearby. Each memory was like pulling a thread that unraveled more of the tapestry I'd woven around our relationship. The job offer in Denver, I'd forgotten about that completely until this moment. Daniel had been so excited about it, a dream position at a cutting-edge startup. But I'd spent weeks talking about how risky startups were, how expensive Denver was becoming, how much I'd miss him if he moved so far away. I thought I was protecting you, I continued, my voice barely audible, from disappointment, from making mistakes, from getting hurt. But really, I was protecting myself from losing you. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the rapid beating of my own heart. Mom, Daniel said softly, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Relief, maybe, or validation. Do you have any idea how good it feels to hear you say that? I finally looked up at him and saw tears streaming down his face, but they didn't look like tears of sadness. They looked like tears of release. I've been carrying so much guilt, he continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. Guilt about wanting my own life. Guilt about not calling you back immediately. Guilt about making decisions without asking your opinion first. Dr. Harrison kept telling me it was normal to want independence, but I felt like such a terrible son for even thinking it. "You're not a terrible son," I said, and meant it. "You're a good son who got stuck taking care of his mother's emotional needs, when he should have been learning to take care of his own." Cassandra was watching this exchange with an unreadable expression. I'd expected her to look triumphant, but instead she seemed almost surprised, as if she hadn't expected me to be capable of this level of self-awareness. "There's more," I said, because once I'd started pulling at these threads, I couldn't seem to stop. "Your father leaving. I told myself that making you my emotional partner was necessary for both of us, that we were a team, facing the world together. But you were 7 years old, Daniel. 7. And I made you responsible for making me feel better about my failed marriage." The memories kept coming, each one more painful than the last. Daniel at age 12, finding me crying over bills and immediately offering to give me his birthday money. Daniel at 15, turning down dates because he could sense I was having a bad day and needed company. Daniel at 18, choosing Oregon State not because it was the best fit for him, but because he couldn't bear the thought of leaving me alone. "I created this," I said, gesturing between us. "This dynamic where you feel responsible for my happiness, where you can't make a decision without considering how it will affect me first. Where you've been suffocating under the weight of my needs but felt too guilty to say anything." "Mom," Daniel started, but I held up my hand. "No, let me finish. Because Cassandra is right about one thing. This isn't healthy. This isn't what a mother-son relationship should look like." I took a shaky breath. "A good mother raises her child to be independent, to make his own choices, to build his own life. A good mother doesn't make her child the solution to her loneliness." I looked around my apartment, seeing it through new eyes. The photos of Daniel covering every surface. His childhood artwork still displayed like shrine decorations. His bedroom preserved exactly as he'd left it, like a museum to his childhood that I'd refused to let end. "I turned you into my emotional husband," I said, the words feeling like poison in my mouth. "When Robert left, instead of dealing with my own issues and building my own adult relationships, I made you fill that void. I made a 7-year-old boy responsible for making me feel loved and needed." The recognition was devastating but also strangely liberating. For the first time in 25 years, I was seeing our relationship clearly, without the rose-colored glasses of self-deception. "And the worst part," I continued, tears now flowing freely down my cheeks, "is that I convinced myself it was love. I convinced myself that this suffocating codependent dynamic was just how close families operated. But real love would have meant teaching you to fly, not clipping your wings to keep you close to me." Daniel was crying openly now, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions he'd clearly been suppressing for years. "I love you so much, Mom," he said through his tears, "but I've been so tired of feeling like I can't breathe without worrying about how it affects you." And in that moment, I finally understood the full magnitude of what I'd done to my son. I'd created a prison of guilt and obligation and called it love. I'd stolen his childhood by making him my caretaker, stolen his adolescence by making him my confidant, and stolen his young adulthood by making him my primary emotional support. The woman I'd thought I was, the devoted, sacrificing mother, was a lie. The truth was much uglier, much more selfish, and much more damaging than I'd ever allowed myself to see. The silence that followed my revelation stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looking exhausted but somehow lighter, as if a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Cassandra sat perfectly still, her green eyes calculating as she watched both of us process this emotional breakthrough. But as the initial shock of self-recognition began to fade, something else started building inside me. It started as a small flicker of awareness, then grew into something stronger and more focused. Yes, I had made terrible mistakes. Yes, I had created an unhealthy dynamic with my son. Yes, I needed to change and do better. But that didn't make everything Cassandra had done tonight acceptable. You're right, I said finally, looking directly at Cassandra. About a lot of things. I did create an unhealthy relationship with Daniel. I did make him responsible for my emotional needs when he was just a child. I did use guilt and manipulation to keep him close, even when I didn't realize that's what I was doing. Cassandra's smile was subtle but triumphant. She thought she'd won completely. But, I continued, my voice growing stronger, that doesn't excuse the way you've handled this situation. The triumph faded from Cassandra's expression. Excuse me? You heard me. I leaned forward, meeting her cold gaze with my own steady one. Yes, Daniel and I had an unhealthy dynamic that needed to be addressed. But you didn't address it. You weaponized it. Daniel looked confused. Mom, what do you mean? I mean, I said, never taking my eyes off Cassandra, that there's a difference between helping someone recognize unhealthy patterns and using those patterns to manipulate them for your own benefit. Cassandra's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? I stood up from the table, feeling steadier than I had all evening. Let me ask you something, Cassandra. When did you first realize that Daniel and I had boundary issues? I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me. My voice carried a new authority that seemed to surprise all three of us. When? She hesitated for a moment before answering. Early in our relationship, it was obvious from the first time I met you. And yet you dated him for 8 months without ever addressing it. You got engaged to him without ever addressing it. You waited until tonight, until you had him committed to marrying you, to finally bring it up. I paused, letting that sink in. Why? Because I wanted to be sure about our relationship before. Because, I interrupted, you knew that if you addressed this issue earlier, Daniel might have chosen to work on our relationship instead of ending it. You waited until he was locked in with you before you gave him this ultimatum. The room went very quiet. Daniel was staring at Cassandra with a new expression, one that looked disturbingly like dawning realization. That's ridiculous, Cassandra said, but there was a slight tremor in her voice now. Is it? Because a woman who genuinely loved my son and wanted what was best for him would have encouraged him to have an honest conversation with me months ago. She would have suggested family therapy. She would have helped him find healthy ways to establish boundaries while maintaining our relationship. I took a step closer to her. But that's not what you wanted, was it? I wanted Daniel to be free from an unhealthy situation. No, I said firmly. You wanted Daniel to be completely severed from anyone who might influence him or compete for his attention. You didn't want him to have a healthier relationship with me. You wanted him to have no relationship with me at all. Daniel was looking back and forth between us now, his brow furrowed. Cassandra, is that true? Of course not. Daniel, she's trying to manipulate you again. Am I? I turned to my son. Daniel, in all those therapy sessions, in all those conversations with Dr. Harrison about our relationship, did you ever discuss ways to improve our dynamic while maintaining a connection? Or did every session focus on ways to distance yourself from me? Daniel's silence was answer enough. And Cassandra, I continued, turning back to her, in all your conversations with Daniel about this issue, did you ever suggest that we could all sit down together and work through this? Did you ever propose that maybe, with some adjustments and better boundaries, we could find a way to coexist? Or was your solution always to eliminate me from the equation entirely? Cassandra's composed mask was starting to slip. Your relationship was toxic. Maybe it was. But your solution wasn't healing. It was amputation. I sat back down but kept my posture straight and my voice strong. Do you want to know what a healthy approach would have looked like, Cassandra? She didn't answer, but I continued anyway. A healthy approach would have been Daniel coming to me 6 months ago and saying, Mom, I love you, but I'm feeling suffocated by how close we are. I'd like to establish some boundaries so we can have a healthier relationship. A healthy approach would have been suggesting we all go to family counseling together to work through these issues with professional guidance. I looked directly at Daniel. A healthy approach would have been giving me the chance to recognize my mistakes and grow from them. instead of ambushing me with an ultimatum designed to make me look unreasonable no matter how I responded. Daniel's face was pale. I never thought of it that way. Of course you didn't, because Cassandra made sure you didn't. I turned back to her. You coached him through months of therapy, designed to validate his feelings of suffocation, without ever addressing the possibility that those feelings could be resolved through communication and boundary setting. You encouraged him to see our relationship as fundamentally toxic rather than as something that could be improved. His therapist only knows what Daniel tells him. And if Daniel was only sharing the negative aspects of our relationship, the aspects you encouraged him to focus on, then of course Dr. Harrison would recommend distance. I paused. Tell me, Daniel, in all your sessions, did you ever talk about the positive aspects of our relationship? Did you ever mention that I supported you through college, celebrated your successes, or was there for you during difficult times? Or did you only discuss the times you felt pressured or guilty? Daniel's expression was growing more troubled by the minute. Mostly we talked about the negative feelings, because that's what Cassandra encouraged you to focus on. I stood up again, feeling more like myself than I had all evening. She didn't want to help you heal our relationship. She wanted to help you end it. There's a huge difference. Cassandra finally spoke, and her voice was sharp with anger. You're twisting everything. Am I? Then explain to me why, if your goal was truly Daniel's emotional health, you insisted on an all-or-nothing ultimatum. Why holidays only? Why not once a month? Why not weekly calls that have clear time limits? Why not establishing specific boundaries that we could all agree on? Because you don't want me in Daniel's life at all. You want complete control over his emotional landscape. And my presence, even a healthy presence, threatens that control. The accusation hung in the air like a physical thing. Cassandra's face had gone from pale to flushed, and her carefully maintained composure was cracking. You want to talk about unhealthy relationships? I pressed on. Let's talk about a woman who isolates her partner from his family. Let's talk about someone who waits until after an engagement to reveal her true demands. Let's talk about using therapy and professional language to justify controlling behavior. I am not controlling. Aren't you? You've spent this entire evening systematically dismantling my relationship with my son, not to improve it, but to destroy it. You've used psychological terminology like weapons, not tools for healing. And you've presented Daniel with an ultimatum that offers no middle ground, no compromise, no opportunity for growth or change. I looked at Daniel, who was staring at Cassandra with an expression I'd never seen before, doubt mixed with something that looked almost like recognition. Daniel, I said softly, I want you to think about something. In a healthy relationship, does your partner encourage you to cut ties with family members? Or do they help you find ways to have healthier relationships with the people you love? For the first time all evening, Cassandra looked genuinely rattled. And for the first time all evening, I felt like I was fighting for my son instead of just fighting to keep him. Daniel sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, his eyes moving back and forth between Cassandra and me as if he were watching a tennis match that would determine the rest of his life. The confident, composed woman who had walked into my apartment hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone whose mask had finally slipped enough to reveal the calculating manipulator beneath. Daniel, Cassandra said, her voice taking on that soft, vulnerable tone I was beginning to recognize as another weapon in her arsenal. You can't possibly believe what she's saying. She's doing exactly what we discussed in therapy, using guilt and manipulation to make you question your own feelings. But something had shifted in Daniel's expression. The doubt I'd seen creeping in during my confrontation with Cassandra was crystallizing into something more solid, more certain. Am I, though? Daniel asked quietly, and the question seemed to be directed as much to himself as to either of us. Because everything Mom just said, it makes sense. Why didn't we ever talk about ways to improve the relationship instead of just ending it? Because some relationships are beyond improvement, Cassandra snapped, her patience finally wearing thin, because your mother is a textbook case of— Stop. Daniel's voice cut through her words with unexpected firmness. Just stop with the psychology textbook language for a minute. Stop telling me what I should think and feel, and let me actually think and feel it myself. Cassandra's mouth fell open slightly. Clearly, this wasn't going according to her carefully orchestrated plan. Daniel stood up and began pacing the small space between the dining room and living room, running his hands through his hair in that nervous gesture I knew so well. 6 months ago, when I told you I was thinking about proposing, do you remember what you said? Cassandra's eyes narrowed slightly. I said I was excited about our future together. No, that's what you said later. The first thing you said was that you needed to know I was ready to put our relationship first. Above everything else. Above everyone else. Danielle stopped pacing and looked directly at her. At the time, I thought you meant above work, or hobbies, or guy time with my friends. I didn't realize you meant above my mother. Daniel. And when I started therapy, he continued, his voice growing stronger, you were so supportive. You helped me find Dr. Harrison, you encouraged me to be honest about my feelings, you asked about every session. But now I'm realizing that you were steering those conversations, weren't you? When I'd mention something positive about Mom, you'd redirect me to focus on the times I felt pressured or overwhelmed. I watched this unfold with a mixture of hope and terror. Hope because my son was finally seeing the situation clearly. Terror because I could see the rage building in Cassandra's expression as her carefully laid plans began to crumble. You're being ridiculous, she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. I was being supportive. Were you? Or were you being strategic? Daniel's question hung in the air like a challenge. Because I'm starting to think that everything about tonight was planned. The timing, the ultimatum, even the way you presented it. All of it designed to make Mom look unreasonable, and me look like I had no choice but to choose you. Cassandra stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I can't believe you're letting her manipulate you like this. After everything we've worked through, after all the progress you've made in therapy, you're going to throw it all away because she's making you feel guilty? No, Daniel said, and his voice was calmer now, more certain. I'm not throwing away the progress I've made. The insights about boundaries and healthy relationships, those are real, and they're important. But I'm also not going to let you use those insights as weapons to isolate me from my family. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I forced myself to remain quiet. This was Daniel's moment, his decision to make, and I couldn't interfere even though every maternal instinct screamed at me to jump in and protect him. Mom, Daniel said, turning to face me, what you did, the way you made me responsible for your emotional needs when I was a child, the guilt, the manipulation, that was wrong. It damaged both of us, and it needs to change. My heart clenched, but I nodded. I know, and I want to change. I want to do better. But Cassandra, he continued, turning back to her, what you're doing now isn't helping me heal from that damage. It's just replacing one form of control with another. Cassandra's face had gone white with fury. How dare you compare me to her? I'm trying to help you build a healthy adult relationship. By isolating me from my mother completely? By refusing to even consider that she might be capable of change? By using an engagement as leverage to force an ultimatum? Daniel shook his head. That's not healthy, Cassandra. That's controlling. I am not controlling. The words exploded out of her with such venom that both Daniel and I took a step back. I am trying to protect you from a toxic relationship that has stunted your emotional growth for 25 years. And there it is, Daniel said quietly. The real Cassandra, not the patient, understanding fiancée who just wants what's best for me. The woman who thinks she knows better than I do what relationships I should and shouldn't have in my life. I could see the exact moment when Cassandra realized she'd lost. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. revealing the cold, calculating person who had been hiding underneath all along. "Fine," she said, her voice like ice. "You want to choose your mommy over me? Go ahead. But don't come crawling back when you realize I was right about everything." "I'm not choosing anyone over anyone," Daniel replied. "I'm choosing to reject ultimatums. I'm choosing to work on building healthy relationships instead of destroying existing ones. And I'm choosing to be with someone who supports that growth instead of someone who tries to control it." Cassandra grabbed her purse from the counter with violent precision. "You'll regret this, Daniel. When you're 40 years old and still calling your mother for permission to make decisions, when you can't maintain a relationship because she's always going to come first, when you realize you've wasted your life being her emotional support animal, you'll remember this conversation." "Maybe I will," Daniel said calmly, "but I'd rather make that mistake than make the mistake of cutting off someone I love because you demanded it." Cassandra turned to me, her green eyes blazing with hatred. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but you haven't. You've just proven exactly what I said about you. You're selfish, manipulative, and incapable of putting your son's needs before your own. He'll see it eventually." "Maybe he will," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "And if he does, I'll have to live with the consequences of my actions. But at least those will be consequences of my choices, not yours." She stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to memorize my face for future revenge. Then she turned back to Daniel. "The ring," she said, holding out her hand. Daniel looked down at the engagement ring on her finger, the ring he'd spent 3 months' salary on, the ring that had symbolized their future together just hours earlier. Without a word, Cassandra twisted it off her finger and dropped it onto the dining room table, where it landed with a small, final-sounding clink. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said. "I hope she's worth it." And with that, she walked out of my apartment and out of our lives, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel and I stood there staring at each other across the wreckage of what was supposed to have been a celebration dinner, both of us trying to process what had just happened. "Well," Daniel said finally, his voice shaky with exhaustion and relief and a dozen other emotions, "that escalated quickly. Despite everything, the confrontation, the ultimatum, the shattered engagement, I found myself laughing. Not hysterical laughter, but the kind of laugh that comes when you've survived something terrible and realized you're still standing. "Daniel," I said, "we need to talk. Really talk. About boundaries, about healthy relationships, about all the things Cassandra was right about, even if her solutions were wrong." He nodded, sinking back into his chair and picking up the abandoned engagement ring, turning it over in his hands. "I know, Mom. I know we do. And I need you to know," I continued, "that I'm going to get help. Real help from my own therapist, not just promises to do better. Because you deserve a mother who supports your independence, not one who undermines it." For the first time all evening, Daniel smiled, a real smile, not the forced, guilty expression he'd been wearing since he arrived. "And I need you to know," he said, "that I want you in my life. Not as my emotional caretaker or my primary relationship, but as my mom. The person who raised me, and loves me, and will always be important to me, even when I'm building my own family." As I looked at my son, really looked at him, not through the lens of my own needs and fears, but as the adult man he'd become, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could figure out how to love each other in a healthier way. It wouldn't be easy. There would be difficult conversations, professional help, and a lot of unlearning old patterns. But for the first time in 25 years, I believed we could build something better than what we'd had before. Something that honored both his need for independence and our genuine love for each other. Something that no manipulative ultimatum could ever destroy. The first attack came at 6:47 a.m. the next morning, jarring me awake from the first decent sleep I'd had in months. My phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, displaying a number I didn't recognize. Still groggy from the emotional exhaustion of the previous evening, I answered without thinking. Is this Patricia Thompson? The woman's voice was crisp, professional, and utterly cold. Yes, this is Patricia. Who's calling? This is Miranda Blackwell, Cassandra's mother. I think we need to have a conversation about what you did to my daughter last night. I sat up in bed, immediately alert. I'm sorry, what? Don't play innocent with me. Cassandra came home in tears, telling me how you manipulated your son into breaking off their engagement. How you couldn't stand the thought of another woman being more important to him than you are. The accusation hit me like a slap. That's not what happened. Isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a jealous, possessive mother who destroyed her son's chance at happiness because she couldn't let go of her unhealthy attachment to him. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. After everything that had happened last night, I wasn't going to let Cassandra's family steamroll me with their version of events. Mrs. Blackwell, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Your daughter gave my son an ultimatum. My daughter tried to help your son establish healthy boundaries with an overbearing mother, and you couldn't handle it. Do you have any idea what you've done? Cassandra has been planning this wedding for months. She'd already put deposits down, started looking at venues, chosen her dress. And you destroyed all of that because you couldn't bear the thought of sharing him. The twisted version of events was so far from reality that it took my breath away. That's not. Cassandra demanded that Daniel cut off all contact with me except for major holidays. She refused to consider any compromise or middle ground. Because there was no middle ground possible with someone like you. Miranda's voice rose to nearly a shout. Cassandra showed me the texts, Patricia, the constant calls, the surprise visits, the way you inserted yourself into every aspect of their relationship. She tried to be patient, tried to find ways to work with you, but you made it impossible. What texts? I asked, confusion mixing with growing alarm. The ones where Daniel complained about feeling suffocated by you, the ones where he said he felt guilty for wanting his own life. The ones where he said he didn't know how to tell you that your relationship was unhealthy without destroying you. Each word felt like a dagger to my chest, not because they weren't true. I'd already accepted that Daniel had felt those things, but because I was realizing that Cassandra had been building a case against me for months, collecting evidence to use in exactly this kind of situation. Mrs. Blackwell, I'm not denying that Daniel and I had boundary issues that needed to be addressed. But your daughter's solution wasn't to help us work through those issues. It was to eliminate me from his life entirely. Because that was the only solution that would work. You're too selfish and controlling to change, and Cassandra knew it. She was trying to protect the man she loves from a toxic relationship that was destroying his ability to have healthy adult connections. Before I could respond, she continued her assault. And now, because of your manipulation and guilt-tripping, Daniel has thrown away the best thing that ever happened to him. Do you understand what Cassandra brought to his life? She's successful, beautiful, sophisticated, everything a man like Daniel deserves. And you convinced him to throw that away to protect your precious mother-son relationship. I didn't convince him of anything. Of course you did. That's what women like you do. You use guilt and emotional manipulation to get what you want, and you don't care who gets hurt in the process. Miranda's voice was venomous now. Well, congratulations, Patricia. You got what you wanted. You get to keep your son all to yourself. I hope you're happy when he's 40 years old and alone, because no woman will ever be able to compete with his mother. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in shock. But before I could even begin to process what had just happened, another call came in. This time, it was a number I recognized, Daniel's friend Marcus, who had been his best man at his brother's wedding 2 years earlier. Patricia, hey, it's Marcus. Look, I just got off the phone with Daniel, and I have to say, I'm pretty disappointed in what went down last night. Marcus, I get that you're protective of Daniel, but breaking up his engagement? That seems pretty extreme, don't you think? I didn't break up his engagement. Daniel made that choice himself when he realized. When he realized what? That his fiancée wanted him to have some independence from his mom? Come on, Patricia. That's pretty normal for a guy his age. I could hear the judgment in Marcus's voice, the assumption that I was some kind of monster who had destroyed my son's happiness out of jealousy and possessiveness. It was clear that Daniel's friends were only getting one side of the story, Cassandra's side. Marcus, there's more to this situation than you understand. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you couldn't handle your son growing up and getting married, so you found a way to sabotage his relationship. And honestly, that's pretty selfish. The accusations stung, partly because there was enough truth in it to make me question myself all over again. Had I sabotaged Daniel's relationship? Had my confrontation with Cassandra been motivated by genuine concern for my son, or by my own fear of losing him? Before I could respond, Marcus continued. Look, I've known Daniel for 15 years, and I've never seen him as happy as he was with Cassandra. She brought out the best in him, made him more confident, more independent, more sure of himself. And now that's gone, because you couldn't step back and let him build his own life. That's not what happened, isn't it? Because Daniel called me at midnight last night, crying and saying he didn't know if he'd made the right choice. He's torn up about this, Patricia. And for what? So you could maintain your position as the most important woman in his life? The conversation ended as abruptly as the first one, leaving me feeling raw and defensive. But the calls didn't stop there. Over the next few hours, my phone rang constantly. Daniel's college roommate calling to express his disappointment. A former coworker of Daniel's who had met Cassandra at office parties and thought she was perfect for him. Even Ruth, my neighbor and closest friend, called after receiving what she described as a quote, very concerning phone call from someone claiming to be Cassandra's sister. Patricia, honey, I'm sure there's another side to this story, Ruth said carefully, but I have to ask, did you really force Daniel to choose between you and his fiancée? Ruth, you know me better than that. I thought I did, but Emma, that's Cassandra's sister, she painted a pretty disturbing picture of what happened last night. She said you used guilt and manipulation to break up the engagement because you couldn't stand the thought of sharing Daniel with another woman. That's not what happened. I was practically shouting now, my voice cracking with frustration and exhaustion. Cassandra gave Daniel an ultimatum. Choose her or me. No middle ground. No compromise. I was defending myself, not attacking her. But sweetheart, Ruth said gently, maybe think about how it looks from the outside. A mother who calls her adult son every week, who drives 3 hours regularly to stock his freezer, who keeps his childhood bedroom like a shrine, and then when he gets engaged, suddenly the relationship ends after a confrontation with you. Can you understand why people might draw certain conclusions? The worst part was that I could understand it. From the outside, without context, without understanding the full scope of what Cassandra had done and demanded, it probably did look like I had destroyed my son's engagement out of jealousy and possessiveness. By noon, my phone had become a weapon of psychological warfare, voice messages from people I barely knew, all expressing their disappointment in my selfish behavior. Text messages from Daniel's extended friend group, some angry, some concerned, all painting me as the villain in this story. Even my own sister called from Phoenix, having somehow heard about the situation through social media connections. Patricia, what on earth is going on up there? I'm seeing Facebook posts about Daniel's engagement being called off, and people are saying you're the reason why. Janet, it's complicated. How complicated can it be? Either you interfered in your son's relationship or you didn't. I defended myself when his fiancée demanded that he cut me out of his life completely. And maybe, Janet said with the brutal honesty that only sisters can deliver, maybe she had a point. You've always been a little too involved in Daniel's life, Patricia. Even when we were kids, you had trouble letting go of things that were important to you. The criticism from my own family felt like the final blow. As I sat in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of last night's celebration dinner, and holding a phone that had become a conduit for judgment and blame. I began to wonder if everyone else was right, and I was wrong. Maybe I was the villain in this story. Maybe my confrontation with Cassandra had been motivated by selfish possessiveness rather than genuine concern for my son. Maybe I had destroyed Daniel's chance at happiness because I couldn't bear the thought of losing my position as the most important woman in his life. But then I remembered Cassandra's cold, calculating expression when she delivered her ultimatum. I remembered the months of therapy she had steered Daniel through, focusing only on the negative aspects of our relationship. I remembered her refusal to consider any compromise or middle ground. And I remembered Daniel himself, standing in my living room and saying that he was choosing to reject ultimatums and work on building healthy relationships instead of destroying existing ones. The backlash was brutal, and it was effective. By the end of the day, I felt isolated, attacked, and questioning everything I thought I knew about what had happened. But underneath all that doubt and pain, there was still a small, stubborn voice that whispered, "You did the right thing. You stood up for yourself and for the possibility of a healthy relationship with your son." The question was whether that voice would be strong enough to survive the storm that was clearly just beginning. By Tuesday morning, 3 days after the engagement dinner from hell, I had reached my breaking point. The constant barrage of phone calls, text messages, and social media attacks had left me feeling like I was under siege in my own home. But it was the email I received from Daniel's HR department that finally pushed me over the edge. "Dear Ms. Thompson," it read, "we've received some concerning reports about your behavior toward one of our employees and his fiancée. While we don't typically involve ourselves in personal matters, the allegations of stalking and harassment are serious enough that we felt compelled to reach out. Please be advised that any contact with Daniel Thompson at his workplace will be considered trespassing and will result in legal action." I stared at the email in disbelief. Stalking? Harassment? I had never once contacted Daniel at work inappropriately, never shown up unannounced, never done anything that could remotely be considered stalking. But somehow Cassandra had managed to twist our relationship into something so sinister that Daniel's own employer felt the need to intervene. That's when I realized that this wasn't just about hurt feelings or social embarrassment. This was a systematic campaign designed to completely destroy my relationship with my son and isolate me from everyone who mattered to both of us. And if I didn't fight back, really fight back, Cassandra was going to succeed. I picked up my phone and called the one person I knew would help me, regardless of what anyone else was saying. My lawyer, Helen Martinez, had been handling my legal affairs for over a decade, and more importantly, she was a mother herself who understood the complexities of family relationships. "Helen, I need your help. Someone is spreading lies about me, and it's escalating to the point where it's affecting my son's career." 2 hours later, I was sitting in Helen's downtown office, laying out the entire situation while she took careful notes. When I finished, she sat back in her leather chair and studied me with the sharp, analytical gaze that had made her one of Portland's most successful family attorneys. "Patricia, what you're describing is a coordinated campaign of defamation and harassment. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" "I want it to stop. I want the lies to stop. And I want my son to be free to have a relationship with me without his career being threatened." Helen nodded slowly. "Then we're going to need evidence. Everything you've told me needs to be documented and verified. Do you still have the text messages from yesterday? The voicemails? The email from Daniel's HR department?" Over the next hour, we went through my phone systematically, screenshotting every message, saving every voicemail, documenting every call. What emerged was a clear pattern of coordinated harassment, with multiple people using nearly identical language to attack my character and threaten my relationship with Daniel. "This isn't organic," Helen observed, pointing to several messages on my phone. "Look at the phrasing here. Toxic relationship, emotional manipulation, destroying his future. These people are either being coached or they're working from the same script." She was right. The similarity in language was too consistent to be coincidental. Someone, undoubtedly Cassandra, had been feeding people talking points, creating a narrative that painted me as a monster while positioning herself as Daniel's savior. "What's our next step?" I asked. "We send cease and desist letters to everyone who contacted you. We document everything for potential legal action. And then we go on the offensive." "What do you mean?" Helen leaned forward, her expression serious. "I mean, we tell your side of the story. Publicly, clearly, and with evidence to back it up. Because right now, Cassandra controls the narrative. She's had 3 days to spread her version of events, while you've been playing defense. It's time to change that." That afternoon, I did something I never thought I'd do in a million years. I created a detailed Facebook post, laying out exactly what had happened that Saturday night. Not the emotional, defensive rambling I might have written in my anger, but a clear, factual account that Helen had helped me craft. 3 days ago, my son's fiancée gave him an ultimatum. Choose her or me. Not, let's work on healthier boundaries. Choose. When I pointed out that healthy relationships don't require cutting off family members, she accused me of being manipulative. When my son chose to reject her ultimatum and work on our relationship instead, she broke off the engagement and left. Since then, I've received dozens of calls and messages from people who've been told that I destroyed their relationship. I've been accused of stalking, harassment, and emotional manipulation. My son's employer has been contacted with false allegations about my behavior. I want to be clear. I acknowledge that my relationship with my son had unhealthy aspects that needed to be addressed. I was too involved in his life, too dependent on his emotional support, and too resistant to his growing independence. These are things I'm committed to working on with professional help. But acknowledging my mistakes doesn't mean accepting false accusations or coordinated harassment. It doesn't mean allowing someone to use psychological terminology as weapons to isolate my son from his family. And it certainly doesn't mean staying silent while lies are spread about me to justify that isolation. I'm sharing this not to relitigate the engagement or to attack anyone personally, but to provide context that has been missing from the narrative. I believe in healthy boundaries and personal growth. I don't believe in ultimatums or campaigns of character assassination. To those who have contacted me with concerns based on incomplete information, I understand your loyalty to people you care about, but I ask that you consider the possibility that there are 2 sides to this story before passing judgment. To my son, I love you unconditionally, and I support your right to make your own decisions about relationships and boundaries. I hope we can work together to build something healthier than what we had before, but I won't allow anyone, including myself, to use guilt or manipulation to control those decisions. I posted it before I could lose my nerve, then immediately shared it in the local community groups where I knew some of the rumor spreading had taken place. Within an hour, the responses started pouring in. The first few were predictably hostile, from people who had already made up their minds about what kind of person I was. But then something interesting started happening. Other voices began emerging. People who had their own experiences with manipulative partners, parents who recognized the impossible position I'd been put in, friends who knew me well enough to question the narrative they'd been fed. My friend Ruth was one of the first to comment. "Patricia, I should have trusted my instincts instead of listening to gossip. Anyone who knows you knows you're not capable of the things you've been accused of. I'm sorry I doubted you." Daniel's former coworker Jennifer, who had called me 2 days earlier to express her disappointment, posted a long response. After reading this and thinking about some conversations I had with Cassandra about boundaries and toxic family dynamics, I'm realizing she may have been more strategic than I understood. "I owe you an apology, Patricia." But the most important response came from someone I hadn't expected, Dr. Amanda Harrison, Daniel's therapist. "Ms. Thompson, I cannot and will not discuss my sessions with Daniel, but I can say that therapy is most effective when it focuses on building healthier relationships, not eliminating them entirely. Your willingness to acknowledge your own role in unhealthy patterns while still advocating for the possibility of growth and change suggests a level of self-awareness that is essential for real healing. Her comment was professional and carefully worded, but the implication was clear. The therapy Daniel had been receiving was supposed to improve our relationship, not destroy it. The tide began to turn, not completely and not immediately, but enough that I started getting supportive messages alongside the hostile ones. Enough that people began questioning the narrative they'd been fed. Enough that the coordinated attack on my character started to lose its effectiveness. That evening, Helen called with an update. I've sent cease and desist letters to 12 people, including Cassandra and her mother. The letters are very clear. Any further defamatory statements or harassment will result in legal action for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and interference with family relationships. Do you think it will work? I think it will make them think twice before continuing their campaign. And Patricia? I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of family manipulation. What you described, the ultimatum, the refusal to consider compromise, the systematic campaign to isolate your son, that's not normal breakup behavior. That's something else entirely. What do you mean? I mean that healthy people don't destroy relationships when they don't get their way. They don't orchestrate harassment campaigns against their ex-partner's family members. They don't try to get people fired or ruin their reputations. Helen's voice was serious. What Cassandra is doing suggests a level of vindictiveness and control that goes way beyond normal relationship boundaries. That night, for the first time in 3 days, I slept peacefully. Not because the situation was resolved, it wasn't, but because I had finally stopped playing defense and started fighting back. I had reclaimed my own narrative, stood up for myself, and refused to be silenced by fear or intimidation. Most importantly, I had shown Daniel that I was capable of growth and change, but that I wouldn't be bullied or manipulated into accepting treatment I didn't deserve. Whether that would be enough to save our relationship remained to be seen, but at least I was fighting for it instead of just hoping it would survive. The liberation didn't come all at once. It came in small waves over the following weeks, each one carrying away another piece of the guilt and self-doubt that had been crushing me since that terrible Saturday night. The first wave came when Daniel called me, 2 days after my Facebook post went viral in our small community circles. "Mom," his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I saw what you wrote, and I saw some of the responses." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Daniel, I hope you understand why I had to." "I understand completely." His words stopped my anxious explanation mid-sentence. "I also saw the email from my HR department. Mom, I am so sorry. I had no idea she was doing that." "You didn't know?" "Of course I didn't know. Do you really think I would let someone threaten your relationship with me through my workplace?" There was genuine outrage in his voice. "I went to HR today and told them that email was sent based on completely false information. I explained that you have never contacted me inappropriately at work, never shown up unannounced, never done anything that could be considered harassment." I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen. What did they say? They apologized. Apparently, someone called claiming to be a, quote, concerned family member, and painted a very different picture of our relationship. They said they felt obligated to reach out based on the seriousness of the allegations, but now they understand they were misled. The second wave of liberation came that afternoon, when Helen called with an update that left me speechless. "Patricia, you're not going to believe this. We've received responses to several of the cease and desist letters, and it's become clear that at least 6 people were contacted directly by either Cassandra or her mother, with specific talking points about what to say to you." They actually admitted that? Not in so many words, but the lawyer representing Cassandra's mother made it clear they want to avoid any legal action. He's agreed to have his client issue a public apology and retraction of her statements, and to ensure no further contact with you or Daniel. And Cassandra? Radio silence from her directly, but her friend Emma, the one who called your neighbor Ruth, sent a written statement acknowledging that she spoke without having complete information and retracting her comments about your character. Each admission, each retraction, each person backing down from their attacks felt like another chain falling away. For 3 days, I had been drowning in other people's certainty about who I was and what I had done. Now, as that certainty crumbled under legal pressure and factual scrutiny, I was remembering who I actually was beneath all the accusations. The third wave came from an unexpected source, Dr. Harrison herself. She called me directly, which I learned later was something she did very rarely. "Miss Thompson, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly, but I felt it was important to clarify some things after the events of the past week." "Of course, doctor. Though I have to admit, I'm surprised to hear from you. I can't discuss Daniel's sessions in detail, but I can tell you that the goal of our work together was always to help him develop healthier relationship patterns while maintaining his important family connections. The idea of completely severing his relationship with you was never part of any therapeutic recommendation I made." Her words hit me like a revelation. "So when Cassandra said you supported her ultimatum, that was a significant misrepresentation of our conversations. Healthy boundaries don't require cutting off family members who are willing to engage in growth and change. They require communication, mutual respect, and sometimes professional guidance to navigate new dynamics." "Dr. Harrison, can I ask you something? Did Daniel ever express a desire to end our relationship completely?" There was a long pause. "What I can tell you is that Daniel's primary concern was always how to love you while also building an independent adult life. He never wanted to lose you, Ms. Thompson. He wanted to find a way to have both a healthy relationship with his mother and a healthy romantic partnership. And Cassandra knew that?" Another pause. "I think that's a conversation you should have with your son." That evening, Daniel came over for dinner. Not the elaborate celebration dinner I had planned the previous weekend, but a simple meal of spaghetti and salad that we ate while having the most honest conversation we'd ever had as adults. "Mom, I need to tell you some things about the therapy sessions and about conversations I had with Cassandra that I'm just now seeing in a different light." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do, because I think I was manipulated just as much as you were, and I need to understand how it happened so it never happens again." Over the next 2 hours, Daniel told me about therapy sessions where Dr. Harrison would suggest ways to improve our communication, only to have Cassandra later reframe those suggestions as evidence that our relationship was beyond repair. He told me about conversations where he'd express love and appreciation for me, only to have Cassandra focus exclusively on any frustrations or concerns he mentioned. She had this way of taking my most vulnerable moments, times when I was struggling with guilt about wanting more independence, and using them to build a case against you, Daniel said, his voice heavy with realization. "I thought she was helping me process my feelings, but she was actually curating them." "What do you mean?" "I mean, she would remember every time I felt overwhelmed by your care and attention, but she'd forget every time I felt grateful for it. She'd focus on the times I wished I could make decisions without calling you first, but she'd dismiss the times I actually valued your input. She was basically editing my own feelings to fit her narrative." The fourth wave of liberation came when I realized that I wasn't the only one who had been manipulated. Daniel had been just as much a victim of Cassandra's systematic campaign as I had been. She had used his genuine desire for growth and independence as a weapon against both of us. "Daniel, I want you to know that everything she was right about, the boundary issues, the codependency, my need to change, I'm still committed to working on those things. Not because she forced me to see them, but because they're real problems that deserve real solutions. I know, Mom, and I want to work on them with you, not instead of you." The fifth and most powerful wave came the following week, when I started seeing Dr. Rebecca Winters, a family therapist who specialized in helping adult children and their parents navigate changing relationships. In our first session, she said something that changed everything for me. Patricia, based on what you've told me, it sounds like you're ready to do some really important work on yourself and your relationship with Daniel. But I want to be clear about something. Recognizing that you have issues to work on doesn't mean accepting blame for someone else's manipulative behavior. What do you mean? I mean that your struggles with boundaries and codependency are real, and they're worth addressing. But Cassandra's response to those struggles, the ultimatum, the refusal to consider compromise, the systematic campaign to isolate you, that's not a normal or healthy way to address family dysfunction. That's something else entirely. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I could breathe fully. I could acknowledge my mistakes without accepting responsibility for Cassandra's cruelty. I could commit to changing without believing I deserved to be punished. I could work on becoming a better mother without accepting that I had been a terrible one. Dr. Winters, I spent my entire adult life defining myself through my relationship with my son. When that relationship was threatened, I felt like I was disappearing. But now I'm starting to remember that I'm a whole person with my own value, regardless of how Daniel sees me. That's exactly the kind of insight that leads to real, sustainable change, she said with a smile. When you love someone from a place of your own wholeness instead of your own neediness, that love becomes much healthier and more sustainable. As I drove home from that first therapy session, I realized that Cassandra had inadvertently given me the greatest gift of my life. By trying to destroy my relationship with Daniel, by forcing me to confront my deepest fears about losing him, she had pushed me to discover something I never knew I was capable of: loving my son enough to let him go, while still fighting for the possibility of keeping him. I wasn't the same woman who had answered that phone call 2 weeks ago, excited about an engagement celebration. I was someone stronger, clearer, and more whole. I was someone who could love without possessing, support without controlling, and fight back without losing herself in the process. And for the first time in my adult life, I was excited to discover who that person might become. 6 months later, I stood in my completely transformed apartment, looking around with the kind of satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. Gone were the shrine-like displays of Daniel's childhood photos that had covered every surface. In their place were my own paintings, watercolor landscapes I'd been creating in the art classes I'd finally had time to fully commit to. Daniel's bedroom was no longer a preserved museum of his adolescence, but a bright, welcoming guest room that could accommodate any visitor, not just my son. The changes weren't just decorative. They represented a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and my place in the world. I was no longer Patricia Thompson, Daniel's mother, with capital letters and an unhealthy level of identity fusion. I was Patricia Thompson, a woman who happened to also be someone's mother, among many other things. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reflection. I opened it to find Daniel standing there with a woman I'd never met, a petite brunette with kind eyes and an easy smile. "Mom, I'd like you to meet Sarah." "Sarah, this is my mom, Patricia." I shook Sarah's hand, genuinely curious about this new person in Daniel's life. Over the past 6 months, he'd mentioned dating someone casually, but this was the first time he'd brought her around. The old me would have been anxious about this meeting, desperate to make a perfect impression and secure my place in Daniel's life through his girlfriend's approval. The new me was simply interested in getting to know someone who was important to my son. "It's so nice to finally meet you," Sarah said warmly. "Daniel talks about you all the time. He's been telling me about your art classes and your volunteer work at the animal shelter." It struck me that Sarah knew about my life, my actual life, not just my role as Daniel's mother. That was a change I hadn't even noticed happening, but it meant everything. "Come in, both of you. I just made coffee, and I have some of those cookies you like, Daniel, though I should warn you, I only made a dozen this time instead of 3 dozen. Daniel laughed, and the sound was different from the strained laughter I'd grown accustomed to over the years. This was relaxed, genuine, free of the undercurrent of guilt and obligation that used to color our every interaction. As we settled in the living room, I marveled at how natural this felt. Sarah asked about my paintings, genuinely interested in the techniques I'd been learning. Daniel shared news about a promotion at work, News he'd already told me when it happened 2 weeks ago, but was now sharing again because it was part of normal conversation, not because he felt obligated to report every detail of his life to me. "Mom, Sarah and I have some news," Daniel said, reaching for Sarah's hand. "We're moving in together." The old me would have felt a pang of jealousy, a fear of being replaced, a desperate need to insert myself into this milestone moment. The new me felt genuinely happy for them both. "That's wonderful! How exciting! Have you found a place you both love?" For the next hour, we talked about their apartment hunt, Sarah's work as a pediatric nurse, Daniel's latest project at the tech company, and my upcoming art show at the community center. It was the kind of easy, flowing conversation that happens between people who care about each other but don't need anything from each other beyond companionship and genuine interest. When they were getting ready to leave, Sarah surprised me by asking, "Patricia, would you like to have lunch sometime this week? Just the two of us? I'd love to hear more about your volunteer work. I'm thinking about getting involved with animal rescue myself." As I watched them drive away, Sarah's genuine invitation still warming my heart, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. Not just my relationship with Daniel, but my entire sense of self and purpose. The weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Winters had been transformative, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of focusing primarily on my relationship with Daniel, we'd spent most of our time exploring who I was as an individual. What did I want from life beyond being needed by my son? What brought me joy that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or gratitude? What dreams had I deferred in my single-minded focus on raising Daniel? The answers had surprised me. I discovered a genuine passion for painting that went far beyond the casual hobby I'd thought it was. I'd found deep satisfaction in my volunteer work at the animal shelter, where my nurturing instincts could be channeled into helping creatures who genuinely needed care without creating unhealthy dependencies. I'd even started dating, something I never thought I'd do again after Robert left. Marcus was a fellow volunteer at the shelter, a widower in his 50s, who shared my love of animals and had his own grown children living independent lives. Our relationship was still new, still cautious, but it was built on mutual interest and companionship rather than need or desperation. For the first time in my adult life, I was exploring what it meant to love someone from a place of wholeness rather than emptiness. Daniel and I had found our new rhythm gradually, through trial and error and lots of honest communication facilitated by occasional joint therapy sessions. We talked every other week now instead of every week, and the conversations were richer, more substantial, because they weren't driven by my need for connection or his sense of obligation. He visited once a month instead of twice, but the visits were more relaxed because I wasn't performing the role of indispensable mother and he wasn't managing my emotional needs. Most importantly, we'd learned to disagree without it being a crisis. When Daniel decided to take a job in Denver, the same city where he'd been offered a position years earlier, I was able to express my sadness about the distance while genuinely supporting his decision. When he asked for my opinion about major life choices, I gave it freely, but I didn't crumble when he chose differently. When he didn't call for 3 weeks because he was busy with the move, I missed him but didn't panic or guilt-trip him when we finally talked. The real test of our new dynamic came when Sarah got a job offer in Denver as well, and Daniel called to tell me they were engaged. "Mom, I know this might bring up some difficult memories from last time." "Daniel," I interrupted gently, "this is completely different. Congratulations, sweetheart. I'm so happy for both of you." And I meant it. There was no fear, no sense of being replaced, no desperate need to insert myself into their wedding planning. There was just genuine joy for my son's happiness and excitement about gaining a daughter-in-law who seemed to truly care about him. The wedding was beautiful, a small ceremony in Denver with close family and friends. I was honored to be included, but I didn't need to be the center of attention or the most important woman there. Sarah was radiant, Daniel was happier than I'd ever seen him, and I was content to be exactly what I should be, a supportive mother celebrating her son's new beginning. At the reception, as I watched Daniel and Sarah dance their first dance as husband and wife, I felt a profound sense of peace. This was what healthy love looked like. Supporting someone's joy without needing to control it, celebrating their choices without inserting yourself into them, loving them enough to want their happiness even when it doesn't revolve around you. "You look content," a voice said beside me. I turned to find Marcus, who had been my date to the wedding, watching me with that gentle smile I'd grown to love. "I am content," I said, and realized it was completely true. For the first time in my adult life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Later that evening, as I sat in my hotel room writing in the journal Dr. Winters had encouraged me to keep, I reflected on the strange gift that Cassandra's ultimatum had given me. Her attempt to destroy my relationship with Daniel had instead forced both of us to build something better. Something based on choice rather than obligation, love rather than need, genuine connection rather than codependent fusion. I still didn't know what had become of Cassandra. Daniel had mentioned that she'd moved to Los Angeles and gotten engaged to someone else within 3 months of their breakup. I felt sorry for her new partner, but mostly I felt grateful that she was no longer our problem to solve. The woman who had sat at her dining room table 9 months ago, desperately clinging to an unhealthy relationship out of fear and neediness, was gone. In her place was someone I was still getting to know, someone who could love freely because she no longer loved from desperation, someone who could let go because she no longer equated independence with abandonment, someone who could build healthy relationships because she had finally learned to be whole on her own. And as I closed my journal that night, I realized that this story wasn't really about a son's fiancé who demanded an impossible choice. It was about a mother who discovered that the best way to keep someone you love is to love them enough to let them go, and to become someone worth choosing rather than someone who demanded to be chosen. It was about learning the difference between love and possession, between sacrifice and manipulation, between family loyalty and emotional imprisonment. Most of all, it was about discovering that sometimes the most devastating ultimatum can become the greatest gift, if you're brave enough to use it as an opportunity to become the person you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.